Welcome to a new Team CGC 9.8 video. I want to talk about if inflation is good or bad for 9.8 comic books. So if you followed the stock market in the past kind of 6 to 12 months, you know that inflation is a pretty big narrative in the investor community. And even if you're like a normal guy, you go out to put gas in your car, you know inflation's here right now with like gas prices at all-time highs, and the housing market is on fire as well. But before we get into the 9.8 thing, just like the basics on inflation. Inflation is kind of the general progressive increase in prices, corresponding with a reduction in purchasing power of money. So, normally a little bit of inflation is a good thing. Like the Fed, they target a 2% inflation for a kind of normal, healthy economy. But 2% is kind of normal, and the most recent CPIs have been around 7%. So inflation is absolutely really high right now. So how is it going to affect these 9.8 comic books? To be honest, no one really knows, but I think the initial data is encouraging. And I say nobody really knows because, like a high interest, high inflation environment, we haven't had that for a really long time. In the 70s, there was high inflation, in the early 80s. But back then, like CGC did not exist. So there's no real like definitive data saying like, oh, like 9.8s did this the last time there was like high inflation. However, if we have a look here at kind of the last 3 to 4 months of just pricing activity in markets in general, I find that 9.8 comics are acting a little bit more like a commodity rather than a stock market investment. Because, 3-4 months ago, I think the investor community really realized that, yes, like inflation is here, it's not transitory, and the Fed is going to have to increase interest rates, which is going to put pressure on companies' bottom lines, basically, make the cost of borrowing higher. So the stock market in the past 3 or 4 months has basically plummeted, and it kind of got a double whammy here with recently the kind of war with Russia and Ukraine. But at the same time, commodities have kind of steadily increased in price. Crude oil had just kind of broke out in the last few weeks here, over $100 a barrel, unfortunately. But when you think about 9.8 comics and commodities like crude oil, fertilizer, copper, nickel, all those commodities are really kind of increasing in price as the stock market goes down in price in the last 3 or 4 months. I think 9.8 comic books have pretty much been trending up in the last 3 or 4 months. Like big, solid key issues in a 9.8, no-brainer key issues, a lot we talk about on the channel, have kind of trended up over the last 3 to 4 months. So it seems like 9.8 comic books are sort of acting more like a commodity than a stock. And for me, that makes sense, to be honest, because, a stock is going to be a classic investment. A classic investment like generates cash. There's a product or service that people really love. The company makes money and generates cash and a profit off of those products and services, and then maybe they'll reinvest it within the company to make more money down the road, or they'll pay out a dividend or something like that. That's like a classic investment. There's cash generation and profit generation. Whereas a commodity is just like crude oil. It just, kind of sits there based on supply and demand. It'll go up and down in price. That's like a 9.8 comic. It just, it looks pretty. It doesn't spin off cash. It doesn't have like an amazing product or service or anything like that. Just sits there, looks pretty, hopes someone else comes down the line and pays more for it over time. So a 9.8 is a lot more like a commodity, in my opinion. So it makes sense that 9.8s are acting a little bit more like a commodity in the last 3 or 4 months. So I think the initial data on if inflation is good or bad for 9.8 comics, right now it's looking like it's good. I think these 9.8 comics are sort of acting like a commodity, and they're kind of so far they've been a bit of an inflation hedge. And whereas, in the last 3 or 4 months, classic investments have really kind of plummeted in value, and you just got to look at the S&P 500 chart, the stock market chart in the last 3 or 4 months. So you know what? The initial signs are really encouraging. It's going to be something to keep an eye on for, because again, like I don't know, there's no data, from 1970 when inflation was really high, in the early 80s when inflation was really high, to say what 9.8 comics did back then. 9.8 comics did not exist back then, but the initial how these comics are acting in the last 3 or 4 months, I think is super positive, because 3 or 4 months ago, I think there was a big opportunity for 9.8s to really like plummet in value if that was going to happen, because a lot of sort of risk assets have really, plummeted in value over the last 3 to 4 months. But it seems like 9.8 comics are acting more like commodities and could be an inflation hedge, yeah, which is pretty exciting. So it's just going to be absolutely something to keep an eye on moving forward here. All right, team, thanks so much for watching, though. I'll see you on the next one. If you're liking my content, please subscribe and hit that bell, and I'll keep you updated on future videos.